Hello viewers and welcome to our channel. Some of you might be aware of the work Bodhidharma Retold, authored by Acharya Raghu, which has featured prominently in our past videos. For those of you who aren't familiar, this historical research work is a deep dive into the life and legend of Bodhidharma. The main sort of thing to look at in this work is how the author has attempted to substantiate that there indeed lived a monk named Bodhidharma in the flesh and that he was the founder of Shaolin Kung-fa. Apart from this, there are other aspects as well that are covered, such as the culture, the lifestyle of Shaolin Zen and Chan monks, the practices and other such aspects of Shaolin Kung-fa. Now, apart from these points, there are also some very interesting, some might say controversial, hypotheses and propositions put forth by the author. Most of them are almost attempts at bridging different people and cultures from India with those in China. So, for example, the author has proposed that etymologically and linguistically, Shaolin Kung-fa is nothing but Buddhist Hatha Yoga. So Kung-fa here being the parallel for Hatha Yoga. Another similar aspect is also his view that the philosophical elements, a lot of them, in Shaolin Kung-fa can actually be found in early Vajrapani Buddhism. And similarly, the psychic practices of Shaolin Kung-fa can be found in the early Guhya Samaja Tantra culture and that of the 84 Siddhas. And finally, he has also tried to relate early Silambat from India and Silat from Southeast Asia with Shaolin Kung-fa. So these are all clearly factors that seem very dissociated, that seem like they are strands in different directions. But once you take a holistic approach, you realize they all actually converge to some place, to some people, some group and some ideology in India, and they have all diverged to again converge to some extent at Shaolin in the form of Shaolin Kung-fa. So today we will be speaking with the author of this work, mainly because recently we have seen some counter arguments and counter propositions which say that Bodhidharma was actually not related to Shaolin Kung-fa. And we would like to get his thoughts on some of these key aspects and also understand whether he still stands by some of these hypotheses that he has made. So Acharya Raghu, thank you so much for talking with us today.
Good evening, Siddharth. Thank you very much. I am honored and humbled to be with you people and to present a talk on Shaolin Kung-fu.
So my first question to you, Acharya Raghu, is, do you still stand by your beliefs? Do you still believe that Bodhidharma was the founder of Shaolin Kung-fa?
Definitely, Siddharth. It's not a belief. I attempted to substantiate the fact that he was not only the founder of Shaolin Kung-fa, but also the Zen. Definitely, I believe.
But nowadays, we have a lot of counter narratives that are coming up. I'm sure all of us here have seen on social media and otherwise a lot of different such ideas coming out and gaining credence. For example, I can think of 3 or 4 such theories. The first one says that Bodhidharma was actually not in China when, basically that martial arts and the fighting culture predates Bodhidharma. The second one says that it is the Daoist culture that actually gave rise to Shaolin Kung-fa, and Bodhidharma or Indian Buddhism has nothing to do with it. The third one says it was Seng-chou who was the founder. The fourth one says it was Vajrapani who was the founder. So you have a lot of such theories going around now which are gaining a lot of momentum. What do you have to say about these?
Well, Siddharth, I came across some of the works and the bizarre arguments. And I have strongly opposed these postulations and these kind of conclusions in my book, Bodhidharma Retold. What I sincerely feel is that these modern scholars, some of them who have advocated such kind of denial, appears to have completely forsaken the Indian side of history. And I feel, it's my personal opinion, that they are one-sided, incomplete, and lack comprehensive approach. Therefore, I don't mind saying that these manuals, instead of calling the historical documents on Shaolin, I may admit that they are like a Daoist manuals, right? So then coming to this such kind of arguments, I have also found that these arguments have completely neglected the strong traditional beliefs not only in China but also in the Southeast Asian countries, where Bodhidharma was strongly related with martial arts culture. By doing so, I feel that they have done a monumental injustice and a tremendous damage to the subject of Bodhidharma and the Shaolin Kung-fu both. So I feel that they have to delve deeper into this subject and bring a better comparative study between Chinese culture and Indian Buddhism. This is my sincere.
So of course, such ideas come from both the East and the West.
Right.
You have various scholars, Eastern scholars and Western scholars such as Mr. Meir Shahar, who have very clearly pronounced that it has come from the Daoist culture. So do you think everything that you said applies to all of them?
Yeah, most of the scholars, be it some scholars as you named it, or some scholars from the East like Chinese scholars, whatever they have presented forward, it appears like a comprehensive study is not being taken into consideration. It appears a partial study, and there's a lot to be done.
And why do you think this is happening? What do you think are the shortcomings? So clearly you believe that there is a comprehensive study lacking, but why do you think this is happening?
Right, when it comes to the question of what are those aspects that these scholars have neglected while undertaking this research about the Shaolin Kung-fa? It's first about the Indian background. First of all, we must be aware of the fact that right from inception, the Shaolin is related with Buddhism, particularly the Mahayana Buddhism, tradition of Chan or Zen, and Bodhidharma. Therefore, it is imperative and it is necessity for the modern scholars, whoever undertaking this kind of research in Kung-fa, they need to first search for the roots in Indian culture, since this tradition is strongly related with the Indian Buddhism and all. If they don't find in such a comparative study, which deals with the Kung-fu and Indian Buddhism, if they don't find such elements in Indian Buddhism, then revert back to the Daoist culture. But whereas, what I found in this modern research is, the deserving space is not accorded to the Indian side of story, be it Buddhism, various other elements. Therefore, any research that is undertaken without taking these Indian Buddhist elements into consideration certainly found to be inconclusive and undependable. Therefore, this is one of the biggest shortcomings in the modern research works, that is neglecting Indian side of story. Right? Another aspect, Most surprising being, this may be reputed scholars or learned scholars, they try to bring a comparative study between whatever rudimentary study that I find in some of the texts. They try to bring a comparative study between Shaolin Kung-fu or Shaolin culture and Theravada Buddhism, or initial phase of Buddhism which existed much before the lifetime of Emperor Ashoka. We call it as a Theravada Buddhism. And these scholars must be aware of the fact that Buddhism is not one monolithic block. There are several phases that appeared later. And obviously, Buddha has advocated not to take up arms, not to look at the battlefield, not even listen to the stories of battle. It is clearly written in Vinaya Pitaka. But this was the story what we are talking about 1,000 years before the lifetime of Bodhidharma. Not the Buddhism that existed during the lifetime of Bodhidharma. I don't understand why these scholars need to bring a comparative study between the Bodhidharma's lifetime culture of Shaolin Kung-fu with the Theravada culture. And then therefore concluded saying that since Theravada Buddhism says that you cannot take up weapons, therefore it cannot be belonging to Buddhism. It appears completely inappropriate, perhaps unscholastic. They need to understand that when they are bringing such a comparative study, they have to, because the Zen, the Shaolin and the Kung-fu all belongs to the Mahayana and later Mahayana culture. They have to compare those elements. It would have been prudent, it would have been appropriate, if at all, the Shaolin Kung-fu is brought in contrast with early phase of Vajrapani Buddhism or maybe later phase of Vajrapani Buddhism. I don't find. So this is one of the biggest drawback, the second drawback. What else I find? These scholars who are treating the subject of Kung Fu history or Shaolin culture must take note of the fact that the Zen or the Shaolin culture is a self-confessed esoteric culture. I mean to say it's a secret culture. It is a well-acknowledged historical fact. There is no dispute in it. They are sworn esoteric or secret monks who wouldn't like to put anything out but wanted to practice everything within the walls or within secrecy. So you don't find any fossilized historical inscriptions or a history from such kind of sworn, dedicated, esoteric or secret monks. So therefore these scholars, once they are dealing with this subject, they must keep in their mind that they cannot treat this subject in a conventional way, because you can't find any records or inscriptions that because they have followed a secret culture. So they have to adopt it to a unconventional, radical, a revolutionary approach to unearth these buried facts. But they can't approach with a normal conventional approach saying that there are no records, nothing. There were historians who clearly mentioned that the early Zen monks were reluctant even to get their inscriptions made. There was an objection. Somebody told me that the anti-historical statement that you must have been using it from Alex Wayman. But no. This is being taken from the very early biographer Tao Xuan, who clearly mentioned that the early Zen monks were even reluctant to get their historical details inscribed, which definitely is an anti-historical character. It's not manufactured by me alone. Then next, coming to one more factor, what the scholars have neglected. The entire tradition of Zen, its practices, its literature, philosophy, etc. Apart from that, the Shaolin Kung-fu practices were orally transmitted. What it is, orally transmitted? It was one-to-one between a disciple and a preceptor. They were never put into writing. Since it is a oral transmission for almost for a millennium, right? Even the first text that surfaced, which clearly pronounces the psychic practices of Yixing, it surfaced almost, it was perceived to have been documented in 528 AD, but whereas it surfaced almost in 1624 AD, with a gulf and a gap of almost a millennium or 1,000 years. Such is the oral transmission character of Shaolin Kung-fu. Therefore, the authors also should be very careful in remembering and taking care of the fact that you can't get any written documents. So this esotericism, when it brought in tandem and in connection with this oral transmission, tightens the culture of the Shaolin Kung-fa. Therefore, nothing comes out of it. It was only during the earlier middle Ming Dynasty period when the printing and compiling of texts gained momentum that some of the Shaolin culture started appearing into the public. And also the interaction between the military and the Ming Dynasty military and the Shaolin also contributed to the same. And one more aspect being the secular people who have nothing to do with the Shaolin. They are not monks but laymen coming into Shaolin and practicing. These are all I am talking about, not during the Tang Dynasty, not during the Song Dynasty, but I am talking about a Ming Dynasty, which almost drives you away to 12th, 13th century. So therefore, the scholars must take note of these facts. One another important thing being the influence of Sanskrit language on Chinese Buddhism. Whatever texts were taken from India to China, they were subjected to the extensive translation projects. And in the course of this translation, today as my scholars, one of our person from Jawaharlal Nehru University, Mr. Reggie, he happened to tell me that there are not less than even 30,000 Sanskrit or Pali words that appear today in Chinese language proper. That means there is a heavy influence of these linguistic elements appearing in Chinese. Therefore, anything appearing in the Chinese with a little corruption of Sanskrit word, like let me say that like dhyana, meditation, which went on to the China became Chan, and later Zen in Japan. Therefore, today you can't consider that it is appearing that as a Chan, it is a Chinese culture. But you have to understand that there was a linguistic corruption. Therefore, give importance, due importance, and accord due importance to the Indian culture. One more thing. When these psychic elements, be it Theravada, Mahayana, or early Vajrayana phase of yogic, psychic, metaphysical, epistemological elements, even the historical aspects of Buddha and other highly celebrated monks started appearing in the Chinese translation projects. Chinese don't have suitable words. Then they started importing the nearest available easy words from the Daoist culture. And they started using those Daoist culture in lieu or instead of Indian words. For example, I find a glaring example, not an example. In Tang Dynasty, there appears a manuscript, of course currently appears to have been lost, Pulomin Daoyin. What it means by? The Pulomin means a Brahmin, Daoyin means calisthenics or workouts. But whereas a Brahmin, it's not an element of Chinese culture in any way. It is perfectly an Indian. And the Daoyin, for calisthenics, since they don't have like maybe yogic exercises or whatever, they don't have a suitable word. So they have imported Daoyin. Since the Daoyin has appeared, Pulomin Daoyin, now you cannot say that it is Daoist culture. Similarly, there are so many elements that they appear in Yixing or a Zisui and various practices of Zen or a Kung-fa psychic elements, right? For example, the Yaksha is called Yacha. The Yaksha staff that you call Yacha Gun, but who is Yaksha? He do not belongs to any Daoist or anything. Like this, what happened, there is a mutual borrowings, right? Superimposition of linguistic things. So anything and everything that appears as a Daoist, these people cannot keep considering that that belongs to Daoist culture. They need to give a due respect because it is strongly related traditionally by folklore, by various cultures. Bodhidharma, Indian Buddhism is strongly related with the Shaolin Kung-fu. Therefore, it is imperative, as I said before, first look into the Indian culture. In the absence of the availability of this, then revert back to the Daoist. This is my another objection. One more important aspect the scholars appears to have neglected being the Shaolin Monastery, that what you find in the 21st century today is not the same monastery which was constructed during the Buddhabadra's time in 494 AD. It has undergone a sea change, various phases. One of the most important thing being that several times the Shaolin was completely destroyed. It was subjected to the ruin, destruction for various reasons. One of the most important reason being perhaps it is owing to the intermingling or influences of religio-political influences, an interaction between the Shaolin Monastery and the monastic establishment of kingdom, or it could be the military and the Shaolin interaction. These all things have brought wrath on the Shaolin. So several times Shaolin was completely burnt and destroyed to the ashes. Some of the things that happened somewhere closer to the 16th, 20th, or 17th century, early 17th century, it was reduced to the foundations, leaving about few other structures. So in the process, what happens? As I said already, it was an esoteric culture and a oral culture. You don't have written documents or inscriptions. Against that background, whatever is little available things were also completely destroyed. The complete literature, the murals and the various inscriptions, we don't know what was the extent of destruction and what it was before. So today Shaolin, as latest as in 1928, one of the warlord from Tangfang, he has destroyed it and again it was rebuilt. So today what Shaolin you find is totally different from what existed centuries before. The next thing being the later dynasty. We call it as, after the Ming Dynasty came the Qin Dynasty, which was not a native dynasty, but it was a foreign dynasty which came from outside, like Manchurians, Mongols. Several people invaded China and they occupied. But what is the interesting aspect here is, since the Shaolin had extensively supported the Ming Dynasty and its army, Shaolin has extensively trained the men and officers of Ming Dynasty in its complex. The foreigners started, the invading foreigners in China started considering Shaolin as a threat because there was a military training. The military training, weapons training was happening in the Shaolin. So therefore, the high degree of training that was imparted to the Ming Dynasty army was a threat to these foreigners. So whenever they invade the China, when they come in, one of the objectives is to ruin or destroy this Shaolin. So, absolutely without a hesitation, we can say that there was a discord or a kind of uneasy relationship between the foreign forces like Manchurians and Shaolin. Here what I wanted to emphasize is, whatever appears in the Qing Dynasty manuals, either criticizing, degrading, discrediting Shaolin, should be taken cautiously, because since the Qing Dynasty is against the Shaolin, there can be a bias. It can be motivated literature. So current scholars who are treating the subject cannot take it at this face value. They have to keep this in the view and then they treat it. Then what comes the next? There are several arguments. Some people say that the martial arts culture pre-existed the arrival of Bodhidharma. Rather, such kind of fighting culture existed before even the arrival of Bodhidharma in 479 AD, according to my version, and there are later versions that who says that it is 520, whatever the case it may be. But some scholars, they argue that yes, there was a fighting culture much before Bodhidharma's arrival, so this cannot be belonging to Shaolin Buddhism or Bodhidharma. There is no role of any of these elements in the Shaolin Kung-fa. Directly it is belonging to either Daoist or the Chinese culture. I would like to ask one logical or a reasonable question. Every civilization, for several millenniums, have a fighting culture, fighting armies. Who don't have? Which culture? Let it be Europeans, Indians, Chinese, every primitive culture, including Egyptians, all of them, they have a highly trained armies. There were several battles were fought. But here the scholars, if they really understand what it meant by Shaolin Kung-fu or martial arts, must take cognizance of one fact, that a military warfare cannot be brought in junction or in conjunction with a highly evolved, psychic, spiritual culture of Shaolin Kung-fu. Shaolin Kung-fu is a spiritual with a completely blown up paraphernalia of various elements of mudras, mantras, recitations, secret practices, preceptor and disciple relationships, deifications. These are things you don't find in any army. We are talking about that fighting which has a spiritual element. Do we have such an element predating to Bodhidharma? Do we have such an element which pronounces saying that we are practicing this martial arts for the sake of spiritual upliftment? Do we have? So we need to compare these elements, not the military elements. So I am not in agreement with some scholars saying that Shaolin Kung-fu existed before the arrival of Bodhidharma. I am not in agreement with that. Another most important aspect, I don't understand if these people have done any research on Shaolin. Is it a compartmental research, reductionist research, or a comprehensive research that takes various elements into consideration and goes forward? So one of the reasons being, the Southeast Asian martial arts culture is very strong in declaring that in certain countries that their martial arts is imported by Bodhidharma. They directly ascribe their martial arts culture to the Bodhidharma. Like some of the things like Silambat, Silat of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Java, Borneo, and all these countries. And this is quite prevalent, and so many, texts were published on this literature. So therefore, there were footprints of Bodhidharma when he traveled from southern part of India, through the Bay of Bengal, through the Malacca Strait, landing at Canton. He left certain vestiges and footprints. What happened to these footprints? Is there any rudimentary research? At least a limited space is accorded to this relating or a comparative study of the Southeast Asian martial arts. I find absolutely nothing. I really wonder, how can you conclude a Shaolin Kung-fu study without taking these elements into consideration? Because in my research, what I found is there are so many elements which have quite close affinity with the Shaolin Kung-fu. Some of the Southeast Asian elements. Similarly, one of the strong objections being, none of these particular research subjects have thrown any light on Indian martial arts culture. I don't say that you have, you don't have, but it merits. Once you are dealing with Shaolin Kung-fu culture, if it is related with Bodhidharma, there need to be basic minimum research must take place on Indian martial arts. Something like a Silambam which is there in Tamil Nadu, something like a Kalari that is there in Kerala, southern part of India. But I don't find anything. Leaving apart spiritual elements, but I found as a martial arts historian, There are several similar and similes that we can draw between this Shaolin Kung-fa and this South Indian martial arts in their approach, intent and stances and moves and gestures, weapons, related culture. I don't understand that is it ignorance or a deliberate negligence? I do not know. But there appears to be a certain cherry picking to shoot their arguments. Finally, one thing I would like to tell to you or to the scholars through the face of this August gathering, that Kung-fa never admitted itself that it is a martial arts. It's a perfect misnomer, a wrong word, a martial arts coined in the 21st century, 20th century. You can't call Kung-fa as a martial art, either it is translated meaning, in its essence, in its practices. It is not a martial art. It is a delicate way. It is a hard way when you translate. And it is totally a psychic culture. Now, these modern scholars treating this subject through the perspective of modern sports martial arts bound to go in a wrong way. It is likely to misguide. The reason being, what you are comparing a 20th or 21st martial arts culture with a psychic culture which has nothing to do with those days, then you start finding for those elements what you see today as a martial arts, you are bound to fail in your project because you don't find them. You find some other things. But have you taken cognizance, have you taken the recognizance of those psychic elements of Bodhidharma, apart from even easing, his respiratory techniques, his massaging techniques, the calisthenics that appeared much even before the Ming Dynasty, they are not taken because you never considered Kung-fu as that elements of a psychic culture. All the way, these scholars started viewing this particular culture as a modern martial arts culture perspective. This is where one of the major blunder appears to have been done. So scholars need to put down their shades of current martial arts culture and look through those glasses which gives you a psychic culture of Kung-fu. And certainly then you find Bodhidharma Indian Buddhism. So these are some of my serious observations and questions and objections that I have put forward in my text. I don't accord completely any significance to these researches unless these things are perfectly addressed and resolved. We can't seem to take those postulations seriously. So this is my standpoint, Siddharth.
So I think another couple of questions that I have. Firstly, there are some scholars who believe it was Vajrapani or even Asangha who were the founders of Shaolin Kung-fu. Any thoughts on this?
I find these kind of conclusions and postulations are ridiculous. The reason being, how can we bring in a deity like Vajrapani? Vajrapani is an imaginary deity, an Yaksha, a Narayana, a Kinnara. This is what is a Vajrapani or a Yaksha, who was an ancient Indian zoomorphic tribe. How can you believe that he is the progenitor or he is the founder of Shaolin Kung-fu? And when you wanted to bring a simile, when you wanted to draw some parallels, how can you bring a person, a historical or a traditional person like a Bodhidharma who lived in flesh and blood with somebody who is like a deity? A deity cannot be a founder. And leaving apart it, I leave it to the prudence of the scholars. And when it comes to some scholars, they have concluded saying that it is Asangha. Some people, they said that it is Buddhabadra who was the founder. It is absolutely unwarranted, inappropriate. The reason being they must understand to which phase of Buddhism they belong. What are their doctrinal standpoints? What are their beliefs? In Yogachara, Asangha cannot be brought in to a Shaolin monastery of a Zen culture, or a Buddhabadra, who happen to be belonging to a Vinaya or early phase of Buddhism, cannot be brought in conjunction with the Shaolin Kung-fa. So I have a serious objections regarding it.
Okay, so I think then the last question that I have for you is, you did travel to China and to Shaolin and traced the footsteps of Bodhidharma over the last few years. When you were there, how were your views received by the people in China, be it the scholars, be it the Zen monks themselves? How were your views received?
I have put forward my points to laymen, scholars and various religious people, particularly belonging to the Buddhist sects, about my research work. It was extensively discussed and debated. One of the congregation that, one of the gatherings or seminar that I had addressed in Nanking on 4th of June and 2018, there were so many scholars who attended that particular. All were unanimously, they agreed with my conclusion that yes, it was Bodhidharma who was the founder of Shaolin Kung-fu on record. They said we don't disagree with you. Similar is the case with the entire Buddhist community. On record, I found their statements that they are in agreement with my research work. What is more important being, on 12th of July, the same year, Shaolin Abbot, the 31st Abbot, Yongshin, on record, he said that we are in agreement with your findings. We completely believe, not only traditionally, historically, that Bodhidharma was the founder of Shaolin Kung-fa. And he also went on to confess, saying that whenever I go to the European countries, I try to put forward this very point that it was the Bodhidharma who was the founder of Shaolin Kung-fu. So they don't have any disagreements regarding this. But whereas, unfortunately, there is some section of scholars, whether intentionally or unintentionally, trying to persistently distance Bodhidharma away from Bodhidharma or Indian Buddhism away from Shaolin Kung-fa. And also it appears that they are trying to ascribe or impose this culture on the Daoist tradition. They seems to have jumped to a hazardous conclusion, whereby damaging the subject matter extensively. These are my observations, Siddharth.
Alright. Thank you so much, Acharya Raghu. I think it is now clear that you still very strongly stand by your beliefs, and also you feel most of these new narratives coming up do not hold ground. So thank you so much for your time. And viewers, please make sure you like and subscribe to our channel to have more such content at your fingertips, and make sure that if you have any questions or comments that you feel free to reach out to us as well. Thank you and stay safe.